Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the meeting entitled The Rise of Pessimism and Its Implications. At the very beginning, I would like to ask Professor Christopher Cocker, Director of LSE Ideas, to give us several introductory thoughts.
Thank you very much, Slobodan. Slobodan has been the moving force, I should say, behind this conference, as he was behind the last one we had, a very successful one. A slightly higher intellectual plane, perhaps, than we're talking about today, if you don't value popular culture. If you do value popular culture, and I do, because it represents, I think, the zeitgeist of the age, then what's happening out there in movie land is extremely important. Just to add, of course, we've been dreaming about the end of the world since, I think, we started writing, and probably before we started writing. So if you think of the destruction of Atlantis, these are parallels, because the myth of Atlantis is an example of how an apocalyptic disaster is shaped not by the gods and not by even man-made forces, but terrestrial forces, a tsunami in this particular case. So it has a certain resonance with global warming. And then many of the late Roman, indeed medieval, but more the late Roman meditations on human annihilation, like the writings, you'll find in the writings of Seneca in particular, are of course actually commentaries on the appalling political situation back at home. But I think that although apocalyptic thinking you'll find in belief systems very different from our own, and times very different from our own, what makes this apocalyptic thinking that we're talking about today very specific and very special is it reflects the anxieties of the 21st century. And you will find those anxieties, of course, in novels, in movies, and increasingly in video games. And you don't even have to be very specific about the apocalypse itself. If any of you have seen the film version of Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road, we're not even told what caused the apocalypse. It could have been anything. It could have been a virus or nuclear fallout. You don't have to identify it. But what made the 1950s, I think, very special, of course, was that people thought about nuclear annihilation in a way that they still don't today. And that was very, very prominent. Elias Canetti had a nice comment when he heard about the bomb on Hiroshima. He said, God is not dead. He's just been hiding away from us in the atom. And now we've unleashed him, and he has returned to history. But for us, it's either artificial intelligence, that we will be outthought and outcompeted by machines of our own making, or it's global warming, which has already, of course, arrived. It's just not evenly distributed, to quote William Gibson's comment on the future having arrived, but it's not yet evenly distributed. And of course, there's, I think, a general feeling out there, which has recently been reflected in some reports from American hedge funds, but the collapse is coming. They date it to the 2030s, that there will be a general collapse of civilization in the same way there was in the Bronze Age collapse, which is why people increasingly go back to that period. So there's a lot to be pessimistic about. There are many other sources of pessimism, many other reflections and manifestations in the literature and in movies that we'll be hearing about today. These are unhappy times for people. So I think it's very fit that we are having this conference today.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I will just make 3 remarks. The first one is my gratitude to the organizers, LSE Ideas and Ratio Forum. We started these conferences last year, and we could not have really organized it at all without the help of the Ratio Forum and specific intellectual atmosphere and culture that has been cultivated by Ratio Forum, which actually proved to be an excellent opportunity for meetings like this. And linked with LSE Ideas, it enabled us to organize last year a conference that Christopher already mentioned on rethinking pessimism in the age of post-COVID. That was the original title, but we who organized our pessimistic conference were actually huge optimists, and we called it post-COVID, and at the end we had to rename it, so it was rethinking pessimism in the COVID era. And it was really very, very difficult to organize because COVID restrictions were still there. It was a hybrid conference, but thanks really to a lot of people, many of whom are here, including Pamela, Oana, and a lot of people from LSE Ideas, we were able to do that very successfully. That prompted us to perhaps go beyond it and to see what kind of effects pessimism has on pop culture. The second thing I would like to say is to thank all the participants who are here, because for the first time all the participants are actually here physically, or the panelists. This was still impossible to do last year, so thank you very much for coming from Britain, Romania, Serbia, and if someone has come from some other country as well. And the third point is that pop pessimism actually has social and political implications, as I think we will see during this conference. So this is not only an intellectual discussion, it's actually far from that, although it includes that as well. It is also a story on how pop culture, including apocalyptic and similar beliefs, influences top politics, including White House politicians, top politicians all around Europe, and how it in a way changes and influences our everyday lives. And from that point of view, it has real social and political relevance. And I hope that some of those things will be covered today at our meeting. So I look forward to all the presentations, and thanking once again to all panelists, I give the floor to Professor Adrian Pabst from the University of Kent, who will chair the first panel entitled Pessimism and Dystopia in Politics.
Thank you very much, Slobodan, and may I echo your thanks to the organizers, to the Ratio Forum, and to LSE Ideas. I think one of the striking things of last year's conference was this oscillation between utopia and dystopia. I mean, for a long time, we thought that modernity in general, the Enlightenment, but then the 20th century in particular, was the age of utopia, the great utopian ideologies of communism, as well as fascism. And then in the second half of the 20th century, the utopia of liberalism, or at least the fight against totalitarianism, and then the end of the Cold War and the triumph of that liberal utopia. And yet we find all sorts of dystopian realities around us. So that oscillation, I think, was one of the striking things that came out of last year's conference. Delighted to introduce our panel this morning, as Slobodan has said, on pessimism and dystopia. And we'll start with a presentation by Christopher Coker. What I'd like to do, in the interest of bringing in our audience, is just to give a few minutes for immediate questions or comments after each presentation, just a few minutes for sort of quick reactions. And then, of course, we'll have more time at the end of the session for longer discussion. But do please come in if you want to ask a question or make a comment on each of the presentations. So we'll start with Christopher Coker, Professor Emeritus of International Relations, but very much...
Emeritus means I'm still alive.
but very much the current director of LSE Ideas, and prolific author of 25 books in total, I think is what it came to. The most recent, Why War, written before the current Russian aggression in Ukraine, but also Rise of Civilizational State and many more. I was hoping you were going to write a book about the zombie apocalypse, but I think we're going to first hear the presentation. So Christopher's talk is entitled The Coming Zombie Apocalypse and What It Says About the Present Zeitgeist. Christopher.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adrian. I discovered this publication in my newsagent. So it's the ultimate guide to zombies, and you'll find the top 66 zombie movies in the world. So I'm just going to leave it here, and during the break or any time, do feel free to look at it. So, what are zombies? There are two kinds. There are those with less mental ability. They approach mindlessness. And there are those with less physical ability. They approach the state of stasis. And both show us the elements of our own humanity that would be most frightening to lose. But that point about zombies is they're us. They're what we humans have become. There's a remark by a character in Dawn of the Dead, George Romero's famous movie, that the humans are the ones that are the most dangerous and where the trouble actually lies. That's the actual message of zombie movies. It's not the zombies, it's the survivors who are the greatest danger to each other. But also, remember, we're responsible for the zombie epidemic. In most movies, it could be radioactive fallout. It's often a virus, sometimes a man-made virus. In biological laboratories, this is something, bioterrorism is something that is going to become very prominent in our imagination very soon. It's the human link that actually makes zombies plausible. An opinion poll was taken 3 years ago of professional philosophers in the United States. 58% of them believed that at some level zombies could exist. And only 15% thought God could exist. But don't scorn the philosophers, because on one level there could be a neurotropic virus that can cut us off from our higher brain functions. And the whole planet is waiting to be taken back by the microbes. As one microbiologist in New York has said, the planet is a platform for the microbes. It's not actually a platform for Homo sapiens. On another level, which is what I want to talk about, which is the metaphorical, the point about zombie movies is the zombies are already here. They are already amongst us. So in Romero's Dawn of the Dead, the survivors hold out in a shopping mall. And of course, it's just a metaphor that we're all in thrall to consumerism. We're all killing ourselves and indeed killing the planet by our obsession with materialism and material goods. One of the seductions of zombie movies, such as 28 Days Later, is its idyllic qualities, scenes of London that are completely empty, without queues, shopping malls that are empty, no cars on the road. This is actually a kind of utopia that we would like to see. We saw it during the pandemic, if you remember the first pictures of London in the first weeks when there was almost no movement on the roads or by rail. And then I think this brings us to the key factor in pop pessimism, that the fear of the end is projected not into the future, but into the present, that we're already experiencing it. That's the point about global climate change. It's already here, it's already happening, and quite possibly it's too late now to do anything about it. Let me concentrate on movies, because this is video games of the future for zombies, but movies are what has brought it into the popular discourse. And there are three kinds of zombie movie plots. First of all, the very uninteresting zombies in Romero's first movie, Night of the Living Dead in 1969. All you can do is kill them. It's rather like the early Hollywood movies in the 1930s, people like Errol Flynn, that showed the great British Thin Red Line being attacked by hordes of senseless and irrational natives. We somehow managed to win because of the machine guns. The point about those is that we had the machine gun and the natives didn't. So if they were continuing to resist, they were clearly being irrational. And the only way of making them see reason was to actually kill them. Now, you can't get zombies to see reason any more than you could actually get governments in 1914 not to send millions to their death in the First World War, where we turned the machine guns on each other and found ourselves in a moral no man's land of our own making. The second kind of zombie movie, because the first would have had a very short lifespan, is you change the rules. So you get the zombies to run rather than to stumble along. They even evolve. In Romero's later movies, they evolve basic intelligence, even empathy. In the original I Am Legend movie from the 1950s, with Charlton Heston in the lead, where, by the way, it wasn't zombies, it was vampires. But the point is that the real villain of the piece is Charlton Heston, who spends every morning driving his car and taking pot shots at zombies. Quite, I think, very good casting, given that Charlton Heston became president of the National Rifle Association some years later. And then, of course, this is the point about zombie movies. They're a microcosm of what our society has become. So in the very first movie, of course, the only survivor of a zombie attack on a farmstead is shot in the last reel of the movie because he's black and African American by a white deputy sheriff. Some things in the American South never change. This fictional world of The Walking Dead, which is the most popular TV series ever made on zombies, it's popular because it mirrors and inspires the modern prepper movement about which we will be hearing. Survivalists love zombie movies because after the world ends, the people in charge are the people with guns. And the third ploy, I think, in a zombie movie is to produce what the late Roger Ebert called idiot movies, in which idiocy reigns supreme. We see it in the present British government at the moment. We haven't seen anything until the first 2 weeks of Liz Truss, I can assure you. Zombies, of course, are idiots by virtue of being mindless, but the humans are the real idiots. They lock themselves away in indefensible positions like shopping malls and hospitals and prisons and schools. And in Romero's Day of the Dead, they lock themselves away in a US Army base in Florida. And I want to talk about why, amongst the cadets at West Point, zombie books and zombie graphic novels and zombie movies are the must reading. Because I spent my life analyzing the military. It's top of the list of reading at West Point. General Dempsey, when he was chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, gave a talk on zombies at West Point in 2013. Max Brooks, the author of World War Z, regularly speaks at places like US Navy War College. Why? Because for a time, the zombie apocalypse was a metaphor for the war on terror. Zombies are the ultimate asymmetric threat because they don't abide by the distinctions that keep wars limited. We try to keep wars limited. They don't have to breed. They produce, they infect you. That's not breeding. They don't have to feed, or they do, but they can still operate without. And they have no military command, no headquarters. They're terrifying because there are no logistic lines to sever. There's no chain of command to take out. There's no center of gravity, to use Clausewitz's famous term. And existentially, they're even more dangerous because they're not motivated by the moral forces that Clausewitz said motivates all our enemies. Courage, hatred. They have no breaking point. There's no point at which they will disintegrate. They will desert, or they will just give up because they don't believe in the cause any longer. Imagining fighting an enemy like that. In our history, we have never fought such an enemy. I think what they really like about zombies is the moral certainty of the war on zombies. Zombies are a virus. They're a plague. They're a visitation. They are, to use a very simple word, the personification of evil. And of course, at the famous funeral oration that George Bush gave after 9/11, he declared that our responsibility to history is to rid the world of evil. And it was Michael Gerson, his speechwriter, and a strong evangelical Christian who changed the original phrase, axis of hatred, to axis of evil. The purveyors of evil come in many guises in the United States. As Carl Sagan said of America, it's a demon-haunted world out there. But zombies, I think, are the most absolute kind of demon and the greatest kind of evil. And if you're fighting evil, the gloves come off. This is the great thing about fighting zombies. Tony Blair had that great mantra, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Well, you can be tough on zombies, but you can't be tough on the causes of zombieism. You don't have to deal with NGO advocacy groups, such as Zombies Rights Watch, or Zombie Aid, or Zombies Without Borders. And the war of zombies carries a clarity of purpose and a vision that no other war has. You don't take prisoners. There are no Guantanamo Bays to worry about. There's no collateral damage when you're dealing with zombies. There's no distinction to be made between belligerent and non-belligerent. There's no just war theory, even though you're fighting evil, because there's no proportionality that is involved. This is why the cadets love zombie books and zombie movies. They get to do whatever they want to do. And I say that not in a critical fashion, because they are hedged in today by all sorts of rules and regulations that their grandparents wouldn't have been when they fought the Second World War. Of course, the problem is that we are corrupted in fighting the zombies. If war just becomes a kill box, you actually corrupt yourself. This is what Thucydides, the first military historian, was trying to tell us, that you are reduced to the level of your circumstances. So in the graphic novel of The Walking Dead, in one of the issues, a young 10-year-old stabs his brother to death simply because he's bored. And the war on against zombieism is a very boring war because it's just about taking pot shots at people who appear unexpectedly at strange moments. As one of the characters in that graphic novel says, this boy can't be accused of doing wrong because he lives with killing every day. How can you expect him to understand murder? But of course, he says that doesn't excuse him because what's to stop him from killing us in the night? So they eventually have to kill him as well. That's the problem, of course, which I don't think the cadets always get, that World War Z would not be a great war to really fight. It would be as morally corrupting as any war that you're fighting. What about the civilians? I think that the great metaphor for zombies is for the risk society that we live in today. And that's a term that was coined by a German sociologist, Ulrich Beck, who used to lecture at the LSE quite a lot. Economists are obsessed with risk capital. Sociologists analyze high-risk behavior. Societies are worried about their children being at risk from everything, including pedophiles who are constantly in our midst. The risk society is a product of environmentalism. It came into existence in the 1960s because we became aware of the toxicity of modernity, of power plants like that in the Ukraine, which create problems when they melt down, or chemical plants like Bhopal that also create problems when they explode. And Beck's main point about a risk society is that it's about unintended consequences, the unintended consequences of our own actions. And this is usually the story behind zombie pandemics. So in the Resident Evil franchise, for example, zombies are the product of the T virus, which is produced by a corporation called the Umbrella Corporation. In I Am Legend, the remake with Will Smith, they're the product of a cure for cancer. So you can be trying to not necessarily produce deadly pathogens, you're trying to produce cures, but there'll be a side effect and an unintended consequence. So what do? Well, if you're rich, of course, you can do what the rich do in zombie movies, and what the rich are already doing in our societies. You isolate yourself in gated communities. You produce walls. We are now building walls for the first time in 400 or 500 years. They're going up all over the place, which produces social isolation, of course. And forget governments. Governments are not going to be able to help you. You have to help yourself. It's self-help. The survivalist message is the point about zombie movies. So 10 years ago, there were only 10 universities in the United States that offered graduate courses on disaster management. Today, there are over 250. One Californian hospital has a zombie apocalypse drill. The US Center for Disease Control has a zombie preparation guide, so you can be prepared for the zombie apocalypse. There are Facebook pages or meta pages giving updates, zombie alerts now. Now, all of these, of course, are intended to help you prepare for the next pandemic. So nobody actually believes that zombies are real. But they do realize that the 21st century is going to be the century of global warming and pandemics, in the same way that the 20th century was the century of revolution and total war. And the two, of course, are intimately interlinked. Global warming produces pandemics as well, or at least amplifies them. So zombies, but are zombies a metaphor any longer, I ask myself. You know, in the 50s, in American schools, US kids would do nuclear drills, get under the table when you see a mushroom cloud in the distance. Now, today, the enemy is inside the school. It's not outside the school, and it's not a foreign power. It's your fellow students, as in Columbine. This is why American schools now have metal detectors to check whether people are bringing guns in. They have surveillance cameras, so that all the kids are under surveillance the whole time. This is what zombie movies are. Many American schools now resemble the defensive compounds that figure in the zombie movie syndrome. And above all, and this is my last point, zombie apocalypse reflects our fear of crowds and cascading effects. And we live in a world in which crowds come together without leadership, without a manifesto, without any specific intention. Copycats, often. You remember the Paris riots in 2005 when 700 cars were burning every night? Only 40% of the people who burnt those cars were so-called alienated young Muslims. The rest were young whites who just thought it was a great thing to do. We live in a world in which people increasingly swarm, and this makes us very concerned. we live in a world of smart crowds that are produced by social media. Take the London riots in July 2011. No causes, no leadership, no manifesto. But there is an explanation for them, and the explanation is boredom. And that is why you should read the novels of J.G. Ballard, who found a world in which boredom is so entrenched that it can only be relieved by grotesque acts of violence. In fact, we're so bored that we've even invented zombie porn. So have a look at the book Porn of the Undead, or an article in Feminism Studies, which appeared a few years ago, called The Politics of Zombie Rape. Well, there we are. We have a lot of people who are watching porn, zombie porn in particular, because they're so bored with what is on offer from the rest of the pornographic industry. So that's my conclusion. Zombies are a very late 20th and early 21st example of our understanding of the apocalypse. They're a metaphor for what we are doing to the planet and what we are doing to ourselves. They're about the present. They're not about the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Christopher. Absolutely fascinating. Are there any immediate questions or comments from anyone? Still early morning, but don't be shy. Yes, please.
Just
Okay.
a thought after when we talked about the last part of the January 6th assault on the Senate was a zombie. It was a good unconstructed zombie attack.
Absolutely. No apparent leadership, coming together for what was, I suppose, the 1960s, the hippie movement had a wonderful term. It was called a happening. A happening replaced the event. An event has a cause, a very specific cause, and the 20th century was certainly, like every other century, the century of events. A happening was just a kind of gathering of a crowd for a couple of days, a couple of weeks at Woodstock, perhaps, whatever it might possibly be. But without the social media, of course, back in the 60s, which made the swarming actually possible. I think, for me, the best example of a smart crowd was the crowd that switched off the fuel supplies. If you remember, 2001, I think it was, Tony Blair's first major revolt against Blairism. All those people came together without any leadership, but they were in contact with each other via emails and via radios, etc. And they just thought it was a great idea to block all the gas stations, fuel stations, so nobody could get supplies of fuel. And the government caved in after 48 hours, because they'd never met a protest like this before, a protest without a manifesto or leadership, which is very worrying for governments.
And probably having of things to come this winter. Yes, please.
Can you consider the later George Romero's film? Because everyone is talking about the first three, but as you probably certainly know that they've made in other zombie movies which are not so famous or successful, maybe artistically, but they raise some interesting points. And when you mention the gated communities, Land of the Dead actually takes place around one such place, and in other Diary of the Dead, he deals with the media, with the found footage, with the documentary, with everybody's carrying cameras and stuff. So I wonder, have you seen those films? And
I know about them. I haven't seen them. But this is the whole point. That his filmology evolves because it's reflecting events which are happening around him. And I think kind of reinforces my point. I mean, I think Romero would have said he's writing about the present and his understanding of what's happening in society.
Those films would somehow alter your arguments or negate them or something. Actually, I just suggest
Yeah,
you see them
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they will give you further proofs, further illustrations for some more recent concepts than those from the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
I suspect that the evolution of the zombie apocalypse will be found in the gaming world, and particularly when meta becomes an immersive reality, becomes a feature, then this will become even more entrenched, I think. And I was just going to say that now that George Romero is dead, perhaps he will be appearing in the next Romero movie.
Actually, there are reports on producing some of these unmade screenplays. So
Oh, really?
there
Yeah.
may be a Romero film, posthumous Romero film.
Yes, that would be a very fitting.
I've seen World War Z.
Yeah, horrible movie.
Yeah, it's horrible movie, but another thing that you mentioned about crowds, no other zombie film that I've seen actually makes zombies as a crowd, as a amorphous entity. You remember those giant swarms, like one unit, one entity. You know, visually, it's an interesting thing that other zombies are not so explicit about, and it illustrates.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And the opening scenes are the best part of that movie, I think.
Yes, please.
To agree to that comment, George Romero is a Pittsburgh guy, right? Also, Romero is a Hispanic thing. I don't know too much about him, but I'm going to make the following comment and then open up to one possible reading of Romero's film in relation to his latest one. Pittsburgh is a weird, I wonder whether to Americanize or globalize the whole zombie sensibility or situate it very specifically, because Pittsburgh occupies a certain imagination within the USA. Okay, so it's a degraded industrial, blue-collar, white ethnic type of imagination, and out of that, Romero comes out with the zombie sensibility. Big films, low budget, and this type of challenge to, I'm going to say it like this, almost like a white panic, white fear. Okay, so there's a certain element, almost like of the ethnic dimension is going to take over, and that's very clear in one of his latest films. If I'm not misremembering, there's a black leader taking over. Yeah. So, and that, I'm going to make a connection that may not be valid, but it may be connected with another series called The Purge. That is, even the latest formulation of that kind of crowd taking over, it becomes very ethnic. Namely, those guys are going to take over, but the whole thing is all about the reconstruction of white fear. Okay, so the point is a reflection to continue the conversation, whether we generalize the so-called American product or whether we situate it. Because if you look at Romero, for example, within the US from the East Coast, there's a different spin altogether. If you look at it from within the US from the West Coast, this fella is middle of the country, the greater post-industrial life has become something else. Emerging out of the ruins of a certain America that is no longer, like 60s, 70s, 80s, and now, each decade will give you almost like a different feeling. If you look at zombie films from a European platform, to me they strike is a different, I don't know where to take it, you know what I mean? It's just a different, so whether to situate or not, and whether we, in the last Romero, I mean, it's almost like you are with the black leader, you know what I mean? You want to go and take over that kind of enclosed society, and you know it's going to calm down. But you don't fear for those guys. It's almost like Manichaean in a certain sense. I stop there. Yeah.
No, but I think obviously zombie movies are going to become a metaphor for immigration in the United States as far as a white audience is concerned. Obviously, young white Americans in their 20s are going to live in a country in which they're no longer the majority by the time they've reached my age. The survivalism is largely a white phenomenon. But interestingly, most of the zombies that you see in the films are white. So, yeah, but I think that's an important point. You're quite right. The European zombie movies are quite different. The Italian ones, particularly in the 70s, and the French ones, and now the Korean ones, of course, as well, which will have different concerns, of course.
Thanks to everyone for their questions and comments. Let's move on to the second presentation by Alexander Evans. Alexander is Professor in Practice in the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And his presentation is entitled, Will Pessimism Dominate the 2020s? Politics, Anxiety, and the Spread of prepper culture. Alexander.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Virtue Foundation and to Slobodan and Christopher for convening this. I think it may seem a sort of an eccentric subject to look at, but I think it's actually a really important one as well in terms of, again, that anchor that Christopher was emphasising on the present. And you know, I'm struck that there's nothing more fun than the sort of the letters in a bottle that are written to the future. And Kurt Vonnegut wrote in 1988 a letter to the future in which he said, now that we can discuss the mess we're in with some precision, I hope you stop choosing abysmally ignorant optimists for positions of leadership. They were useful only so long as nobody had a clue as to what was really going on during the past 7 million years or so. In my time, they've been catastrophic as heads of sophisticated institutions with real work to do. So I think there's something interesting at the moment about the times we are living in and that move back into sort of anxiety and volatility and perhaps a greater seriousness about the challenges of government and that interface with popular culture, which I think is very true. I'm going to begin perhaps just by talking about the age we're living in. And I'm struck that we've just lived, I would argue, through a 30-year period of intermission without really realizing it. What do I mean by that? There is a history of naming of different ages, but almost always after the fact. So World War I only became a reality after World War I. World War II only became named after World War II. So each age is really anticipated by those who live in it. The Cold War was already underway before Bernard Barrett called it that. And we're in this sort of strange position at the moment of having lived through an age that we don't yet know the name of. So I would posit, as it were, intermission as a name for that. Why? Because the last 30 years have been bookended by the end of the Cold War and a period, I think, of both distraction and optimism as prevailing forces. And it picks, Adrian, up on what you were saying as well, if you like, that sort of heightened sense of positivity around the liberal ideal. And not just one new crisis of COVID-19, but if you like, a series of conjoined and related crises that we are now experiencing. So the intermission is over and we're returning to our seats for an altogether more serious next act. And I think that is also kind of, if you like, a repudiation of some of the themes that dominate, or some of the writings that dominated that, both on international politics and on culture and society. So if you think about Robert Cooper, the British diplomat, in terms of his optimistic vision of what postmodern order might look like in the 1990s, it offered sophisticated variants, but at least there was an aspiration there that a European acquis, a positive acquis, would be the acquis that might be the high watermark of the future. And I'm not sure that there would be such confidence now in whether that acquis would have the same salience or dominance. Steven Pinker's work on progress in humanity, which rightly pointed out that humanity has made great strides in terms of reducing death rates, tackling disease, reducing poverty, even the reduction over time in deaths through war. But of course, what he's looking at is the aggregate. He's looking at the longue durée, and he's looking at percentages of the human population. What he's not looking at is the absolute. So what's the absolute experience? And actually, against the lower population levels in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, you're actually talking about probably, in some instances, a greater quantum of suffering in the 21st century than was true if you look back 400 or 500 years. And of course, if you're an individual who's starving, or if you're an individual being tortured or under bombardment in a city in Ukraine, it feels perhaps less material about whether you're part of the luckiest generation in history. It doesn't feel particularly lucky if you're experiencing it directly. So I think it's less the crisis of the coming winter and this winter to come that should be on our minds, as serious as it is, but the slow rolling crisis that could shape the next decade. And I would argue that we're seeing an international levelling down, to coin a British political phrase. And it's a levelling down of job security. It's a levelling down of life expectancy. For example, American life expectancy has dropped 3 years since 2020, and of confidence in the future. And I think that metric on confidence in the future is the most material one, because that has the direct relationship with pop culture. it feeds off anxieties in pop culture, in television, in video games, but it also contributes to the appetite that people have to be kind of reminded of their anxiety and to gamify, if you like, their anxiety through it as well. And one author, I think, has a rather good phrase on this. She talks about the new world of apocalypse. But if you like, you've had the very idea of the apocalypse, the very idea of anxiety, increasingly commercialized and packaged into products that will basically try and alleviate the boredom that Christopher was talking about. So the first is really about the period we're living in. The second is that confidence in utopianism is giving away, and obviously confidence in utopianism is giving way to anxiety and pessimism. What we don't yet know is it a brief term or is it an enduring one? And you know, we used to know where the future was, and the future was California. If you remember, you know, historically there was always that sense that America was the future in the late 20th century. Even if de Gaulle famously, on his first trip to California, gazed around the cityscape as he was driving through the city and said to nobody in particular in the car, "This will end badly." But we had if you like, a defined geographic point of the future in the late 20th century, which was American culture. American culture, the American future, the American dream was almost the international reference point, even if you repudiated it. So even for those who loathed America, you would have that bit of graffiti that was famous, I think, from Bangladesh, "Yankee, go home, but take me with you." So that sense that you know, America represented an optimistic utopian future that could be aspired to. Well, actually, I would argue now we're in this very strange mode where there is no longer a geographic focus for the future that might be either shared or part of that sort of popular image of positivity. And that's what fuels, if you like, the deterritorialization of the future. There isn't even a sort of a democratic anchor on which we could place our dreams. So let me turn to prepper culture. I think prepper culture is a good example of how what was once a marginal social trend went more mainstream and driven as much by the internet entertainment and vigorous marketing as anything else. It was amplified by crowd politics. It was amplified by social media. And for all the concern about bots and state-level disinformation, the new pessimism was widespread and I would argue peer-to-peer and social. It was almost a social infection, like all trends, like all fashions. And despite it being known as an American cultural phenomenon, prepper culture has increasingly moved across borders, naturally enough, because the export of American anxiety is one of the few aspects of globalization that has yet to be disrupted by the new volatility that we're seeing. So even if you've had perhaps a diminishing faith in America as the sort of the reference for positivity, democracy in the future, that reference to American culture has still informed, I think, some of the apocalypse across this space, like prepper culture. But the American trends are localized, and we see that, for example, in German and Russian versions of post-apocalyptic television series. So what you have, if you like, is still, if you like, an American-shaped popular culture around this. But, you know, even if you just gaze across a Netflix offering, Black Summer, The Rain, Into the Night, To the Lake, Tribes of Europa, the Turkish-made Yamakoz S245, what you have now are localized variants of what used to be a globalized cultural phenomena. And prepper culture offers an intriguing window into the combined politics of disempowerment and renewed agency. The assumptions underlining it is that there's little that can be done to reshape politics or public policy to avoid the crises to come, whether they are made by humanity or the result of nature. But there is much that an individual or family unit can do to prepare to navigate their way through it. It's a larger movement than we now think, amplified by the experience of COVID. And indeed, you know, that lived experience of COVID when people went into grocery stores and found that they couldn't, you know, the shelves were bare of products, has apparently amplified the numbers of people who are at least interested in preppers. Some preppers call non-preppers sheeple. There is a lovely subreddit in American prepper culture, We the Sheeple, about the sheeps who haven't got the agency to consider how to protect themselves against a fearful future. American preppers claim that 60 to 70% of Americans are preppers, perhaps unlikely. A 2017 survey suggested that roughly 20% of Americans spent money on survival items that year. That preceded COVID, of course. And a further 35% said they already had what they needed for an emergency, who of course were mostly lying. Estimates of committed preppers are in the range of 6 to 7 million in the United States. But precise estimates are difficult to land because a range of preppers advise against advertising your status. If you've got the stock of food and medicines in your home, the last thing you want is your neighbours to come by and raid and basically benefit off your piece. So you have, if you like, a community of stealth survivalists. And I say that to the extent that actually many of those people are not, if you like, the uneducated, rural, or indeed the educated but eccentric repudiants of modernity. It's actually ordinary people in middle-class jobs on the left and the right who have a sort of personalized anxiety about the future, which is why it's so interesting as a trend to think about a generation who are much more concerned about this. And like all trends, there's money to be made on this. Given their numbers and willingness to spend money, says one article, catering to doomsday preppers has become a multi-billion-dollar business in America. Regardless of which item's been considered, every $1,000 of expenses for just 1 million people comes to a $1 billion market. And if you think this is just sort of odd businesses cashing in on anxiety, you can go to Costco to buy the Chef's Banquet all-purpose readiness kit for $149.99 with more than 600 servings of premium just add water meal options and a life expectancy of 20 years. And if you don't think just storing food is enough, you can buy your Doomnado shelter for $18,800, which is a fully secured shelter allegedly that can protect you from all manner of attacks to which you could retreat. So prepper culture, I think, illustrates a retreat to the individual with a primary focus on survival. Another theme picking up almost from the last Canetti. And one American prepper last month, Pickled Prepper, put it on their blog. Our role as preppers, you and I only have one job during the time of war, to survive. We must shift from a prepper view where we prepare to survive to the survivalist mode in which we actively practice survival. So again, you see these forms of, if you like, there's such a resonance there with computer game culture, indeed with zombie movies and so on. But prepper culture is also symbolic of a macro-political trend that we should pay attention to, which is a renewed growth of patrimonialism. So I know a series of Ratchi Foundation conferences have focused on the renewed politics of populism, be it in Europe or elsewhere. But patrimonialism and its link to corruption and its link to seeking, if you like, a roof, individual sponsors, is actually on the rise in many societies, including in modern advanced democratic societies. And if confidence in the government and the future is eroding, the retreat into familial or small group or patrimonial networks will only grow. So we may find the most curious of combinations, greater demands of the state and state expenditure, so a greater expectation of an activist state in politics, with a call for a bigger state that may prove irresistible. And yet alongside that, an ambivalence about the motives or fairness of the state. And so a far greater likelihood of seeking special favours and considerations within it. So if you like, almost this politics of anxiety can act as an accelerant to patrimonialism, which doesn't necessarily eliminate democracy, but it might reframe democracy in a very different way to the form that we've been used to in recent decades. And conspiratorial thinking about the state may grow in an era when people feel disempowered. And of course, conspiracy theorizing, again, sometimes considered a particular American product, is far more universal. Indeed, there's been a very strong European experience in history to conspiracy theories and how that is then animated in politics and popular movements. But as The Economist commentated recently in a book review, The idea that some shadowy group or other is running things for their own benefit, not that of the ordinary working man, is, after all, the constant solace of the unsuccessful. And a national disaster such as Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy, or the September 11th attacks are likely to bring forth particularly wild conspiracy theories, since the alternative explanations, incompetence or inherent vulnerability, are simply too painful to bear. So I think there's also something here about, conspiracy theories are one response to that feeling of disempowerment that is contemporaneous with a sense of slipping living standards and slipping confidence about the future. And so it's not the decline of democracy, I think, that should worry us necessarily, but its decay. And of course, all collapses tend to not work as per the movies. They don't tend to be immediate, an immediate shock. They tend to be slow, not fast. And so like biological aging, when your knees and your teeth go first, and I say that as a recent investor in dentistry to a greater extent than I thought possible as a 48-year-old, but also around sort of geopolitical collapses. And as a descendant of people who once had power in the Gaelic world, the collapse of the Gaelic world from 1450 to 1650 took 200 years. The Lord of the Isles and the islands between England, Scotland and Ireland faded in power during that period. The Ottoman Empire took 600 years to decline, the Roman Empire 300 years plus, and even the end of the British Empire took decades, not years. So a little bit of this is we should be thinking slow, not fast, about the prospective decade ahead. So what about that coming decade? We should swerve the disease that infects social commentators, which is extrapolitis, the most infectious disease of all. And that's a temptation to extend out in the image of the age we're living in. And that's what infects popular culture today. So just as the over-optimism of the 1990s misled, I think, a generation of policymakers and did not prepare us well for the age we're coming into now, it would be equally erroneous to fall into the trap of thinking that extrapolating from pessimism and anxiety is the only way to handle politics ahead. But it's a reasonable assumption that volatility and reduced levels of citizen confidence in the future across many societies will encourage a grittier sense of pessimism amongst some. But pessimism, of course, doesn't play in democratic politics. Voters want hope and plans, even if accompanied by searing critiques of how we got here, and whose fault it is. Never, incidentally, the politician who's setting out their case at the time. So we may end up with a worrying combination: disengaged citizens, particularly those in the centre of politics, disinclined to actively campaign for politicians, but likely motivated by protest votes. Politicians encouraged to pitch positive and wax lyrical with an accelerated political motivation to spend and borrow today for short-term effects. A politics of crisis, which may reinforce the short-termism that already afflicts many governments, despite the fact that most major challenges are longer-term in nature. And perhaps there's an interesting angle here on which parts of a society remain focused on the long-term future. And Jordan Mackenzie, a writer, suggests that two main examples are at the margins. On the one hand, millennial utopians, and on the other hand, preppers and survivalists, as sort of expressive communities of optimism and pessimism that have influence in popular culture. And each of them take the future very seriously, and each enjoy greater appeal in an age of increased anxiety about the future. Which is why new forms of old politics may be the result. George Nash, one of the most thoughtful writers on the American conservative movement, has reflected that Donald Trump managed to forge a new politics, incidentally he's an anti-Trumper, that drew on all the wellsprings of discontent in America. And his argument is that what Trump has managed to do is fundamentally reform the politics of animating that discontent in lots of different ways. So if the present is ugly and the future is compromised, the past repudiated and hope elusive, what form of politics can we see ahead? Democratic politicians will deal with the revival of anxiety and pessimism. They're likely to trade in the currency of promises, and promises widely and wildly kept, all but guaranteed disappointment. But before we get too anxious, we should reflect that even that politics of populism and of railing against the establishment was used by Macron in France and Obama in America, as one conservative writer observed in the New Criterion in New York. Populism is part of a democratic tradition. But I would argue that it's not late 20th century rootlessness we should be worrying about, but beliefs strongly held. And finally, pessimism influences decision making in the longer term, the generation of decision makers to come. So for all the right focus on the now and on the next decade, what's going to be really interesting is what will the generation of decision makers in 2030 or 2040, whose formative experiences will be living through this age and seeing the public policy responses to that, determine about what that means for society, for public policy, and for politics. So the long-range impact of this cultural anxiety may be even more interesting to consider than its immediate impact either this winter or in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexander. Really, really interesting. And again, I'd like to invite any questions or comments in response. Christopher.
Thank you, Alexander. One point you didn't mention, I think, is levels of social and economic inequality, which are, and I was thinking during your talk that the only people who can really survive and buy what is required are the preppies who become preppers. It's quite a good mantra, preppy, becoming a prepper. And I'm thinking of people like Peter Thiel, who's now bought a very large gated community. Well, he hasn't yet gated it, but it's a very large chunk of New Zealand where he intends to disappear come the apocalypse. Or the very rich who, for I think $15 million, can buy a Minuteman III silo, which is really located down earth with massive steel doors. If you've ever been, unfortunately, I have been in one, so I know what they're like. They're wonderful places. They have cinemas, they have gyms, you know, you have neighbors, and you can stay down there for 15 years until the apocalypse goes. The other thing is commodification. And the first person to put his finger on that was Herbert Marcuse in One Dimensional Man, where in one of his footnotes, he had a company that was selling nuclear fallout shelters for the rich, with every mod con available. They were very adaptable. You could use them as a granny flat before the nuclear bombs arrived. You could then evict granny and come in there yourself with your immediate family members. So he said this is the first time that capitalism, I sound like a communist, but anyway, it's the first time that capitalism had commodified death. No one had tried to do that before. So I think the commodification of death is a very interesting thing, because it's death which haunts and animates everyone's fears. It's not life, it's death now.
No, look, I mean, that's a very fair point. And I mean, I think there's something interesting, though, that a lot of this marketing of survivalist materials has not been marketed to, you know, the preppies, as it were. The preppies can afford to go and buy the Whole Foods version or the J. Crew version, as it were, of what they need. But actually, it's been marketing to the relatively poor. So there's a form of, if you like, prep exploitation of people who can ill afford it, who are then encouraged to buy these products, but of unclear quality. But I agree. Essentially, anxiety is entertainment, is the preserve of the middle classes. Anxiety is survival, is the preserve of the properly poor. And as you get an environment where there is less and less of a buffer, you know, people can't afford enough gas in their cars, people can't afford reserves of food in their homes, there is no buffer financially. Actually, it's much more material about what will the political effect be on that group of people rather than necessarily the people who've been consumers of the entertainment.
Are there other questions or comments? While you've got one, Slobodan, okay, because I've got one as well, but we don't want to make this too much an intra-panel discussion at this point. But go on, please.
It's just about the definitions. So you referred to millennialists as pessimists and preppers as potential optimists. But it depends whether you look from an in-group or out-group perspective. Because from the millennialist perspective, they're optimists, definitely, because they're going to end up in paradise. The fact that all the rest of the humanity will be annihilated is of no relevance for them. So they're very huge optimists. And from their point of view, preppers are total pessimists. So why is this important? Because up to 60% of Americans believe in some form of millennialism, and therefore it's not necessarily even the standpoint of minority in certain aspects, although hardcore millennialists are a smaller group, perhaps 25% or even less, but even in 25%, every fourth American. So for them, there is a different perspective. That's what I wanted to say, because that influences pop culture.
Look, I mean, I very much agree, and there's something here about what's your conception of the future. As an aside, there's a really interesting bit of work on the end of history. Now, I don't mean here the end of history in terms of debate about liberalism in the 1990s, but this is psychological literature on how we think about ourselves. But from the age of, from late teens onwards, we tend to think that we as human beings are finished products. But actually, our preferences can change quite significantly over time. So there's something about temporal literacy as well with these communities. But I agree with you, Slobodan. I mean, I think the prepper community would argue, and I've talked to a range of people in the prepper community. I should say, full disclosure, I'm not a member of it myself. I'm not a stealth prepper.
You're not
I just don't have the planning capability, as my family tell me. But I think they would argue also that they're realists, which I think is interesting. And it's interesting about the use of that language of realism rather than necessarily positivity.
Alexander, I had a question about the tech billionaires. I mean, you mentioned Peter Thiel, or rather Christopher mentioned Peter Thiel and his escape to New Zealand. But of course, that assumes that the apocalypse will not extend as far as New Zealand. But if we had a sort of generalized climate
on the beach.
apocalypse, yeah, that's right. What about the class of tech billionaires like Musk and Bezos and others who are now seeing the future very much in terms of Mars, not just the travel, but in fact, setting up stall in Mars, creating a kind of higher form of existence there, linked to all of their attempts to either defer mortality and aging or, abolish it altogether, technologically enhanced intelligence and all the rest of it. How does that fit into your narrative, the sort of escape to Mars? Hopefully with one-way tickets so that we don't see these people again, but not sure we...
There is a very short film that's been issued, I think, on Netflix, which is a film about, it's a cartoon animation about how one would survive the collapse of life on Earth. And it shows, the steady deterioration of Earth, the rockets lifting off for the people who've been smart enough to do it, and a new colony being established, presumably on Mars. And the great reveal at the end of the video short is it's cats who are living in and what don't you think we wouldn't be here? Not humans, because humans, of course, are too stupid to have made it. So it's actually quite an interesting analogy. My slight thought on that is, at least according to the prevailing winds of cosmology now, the universe will eventually run extinct. The Earth will run extinct. There is no prospect for eternity for the human race. And that, I think, is what's interesting is that even that tech utopianism, even the sort of the space futurism that represents, doesn't really seem to grapple with that long-range question of the future. But I would echo that point that Christopher was making. I mean, I think almost a lot of this is bound up with anxiety and that desperate fixation upon survival, and if not survival of yourself, then survival of your biological sort of successors, and a fear of death.
Some quick ones. Yes, of course.
Sorry, just in terms of the Musk vision of Mars, I hate to be very pessimistic, but there is something called the Kessler effect, which means there's so much space debris up there that quite soon no rockets will be able to make it out of Earth's atmosphere to the moon or anywhere else. I only mention this because NASA a few months ago said the prospect was very real and it was much nearer than most people think.
And they've now delayed their launch twice.
Yeah.
Great, thank you again, everyone, very much for this. Let's turn to the third presentation by Slobodan Markovich. Slobodan is professor in the School of Political Science at the University of Belgrade, and also has a long-standing association with the LSE and LSE ideas in particular. Slobodan's presentation is entitled Hollywood Apocalypse, Social Anxiety and Politics of Fear. Over to
No
you.
need, I think. Okay, whatever.
We now switch off the lights for some light entertainment. Yeah, exactly. They won't come back on thanks to Vladimir Putin.
Okay.
Should I move out of the way?
After September 11, and particularly around the alleged Mayan doomsday in December 2012, apocalyptic movies began to mushroom. In July 2013, referring to the latest Hollywood movies, a New York Times columnist wrote, "Our enchantment with annihilation, be it from exotic astronomical event or a mundane villainy, is powerful and kaleidoscopic. By apocalypse in this presentation, I refer only to those films, novels, and works of art that prophesize either total or almost total annihilation of mankind. In this presentation, I will exclude all those works that deal with apocalypse that was just about to happen, but was averted by human heroic intervention. Since the theme has been exploited in the United States and was then exported globally, one is tempted to find the answer: where does this idea on apocalypse and total annihilation come from within the American intellectual history? And one can clearly identify at least two major streams. One would be from biblical millennialism, and the other one from scientific catastrophism. But one should also add literary imagination and various forms of nihilism as additional sources. Paul Boyer, who is considered to be a classical author in the field of biblical prophecies, summarized the views of America's destiny provided by premillennial writers. Quotation: "From these works emerges a picture of a nation mired in wickedness and trembling on the brink of chaos. A nation whose destiny is as grim as it is certain. America's modernity is devilish in its essence." That is the main message and conclusion of this group of preachers and authors. What exceptionalists in American mainstream would see as American grandeur, premillennialists see as America's fall. As Boyer summarized it, whatever the specific scenario, nearly all prophecy interpreters from the end of World War II through the 1980s foresaw a weakened America sinking fast as the end drew nearer. Let us take Wilbur Smith, for instance. Wilbur Smith is considered as Christianity's #1 booksworm, so one of those preachers who was very educated, who has one of the biggest libraries. He speculated that God may have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with nuclear power. That is, of course, reference to Hiroshima. And that a world government without God's blessing would only lead to global tyranny under Antichrist, very popular topic among those preachers. Because atomic weapons are Lord's weapons, civil defense in atomic era was futile, Smith claimed, and many actually biblical preachers followed him in that. And this is a political implication of all of that. Echoing Smith, many authors dismissed the control of nuclear energy and weapons, and at some point it even had political impact. Even the country music was actually affected by it. There is a famous hit song by Frank Kirby entitled Atomic Power from 1945. Actually, just for the purpose of amusement, I will give you one extract from it, just to realize that how far this idea that even atomic energy was divine's product was spread in America.
Oh, this world's at a tremble with its strength and mighty power. They're sending up to heaven to get the brimstone fire. Take warning, my dear brother, be careful how you plan. You're working with the mighty power of God's own holy hand. Atomic power,
etc. In other words, even atomic bomb is a part of divine's providence and has nothing to do really with humans. Just a moment. Moreover, nuclear or similar holocaust was unavoidable during end time, they claimed, but Christians were not supposed to be worried about that at all. An author in 1967 wrote, "Thank God, I will get a view of the Battle of Armageddon from the grandstand seats at the heavens. All who are born again will see the Battle of Armageddon, but it will be from the skies." So actually, Christians should not be worried at all about the end of the world, about nuclear annihilation. They should look forward to it. That will be their redemption point. Boyer described a very bizarre element of this narrative, or as Boyer says, prophecy writers viewed nuclear holocaust from a unique vantage point. They described its horror as graphically as any nuclear activist, but not as a possible historical outcome to be avoided at all costs. Fusion of classical preaching with modern technologies created radio and then tele-evangelism, followed by all subsequent technological innovations, including internet and social media. Evangelical books were sold in millions of copies, radio network aired famous preachers, and then specialized TV networks followed the same pattern. Back in 2012, Ned Labo assessed that Christian popular culture was a $7 billion worth growth industry. Impact on film industry was just a matter of moment, and this combination emerged in the 1970s with the first series of films based on rapture, such as A Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder, Image of the Beast, and more popular films focused on the advent of Antichrist. The famous one were The Omen, Damien, Omen 2, and The Final Conflict. Is this whole phenomenon politically relevant? Paul Boyer, Eugene Weber, who is, by the way, an author from Romania, who we very often quote here because he wrote another famous book, Peasants into Frenchmen, but his whole career was in California. So Eugene Weber or Ned Labo, they all think that it has political implications. And let us see if there was any political influence. Going back to history, or through history, it is interesting to note that even Truman, in the privacy of his diary, responded in biblical terms to the first A-bomb test in New Mexico, or as he put it in his diary, "It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and the fabulous ark." End of quotation. It was, however, during Ronald Reagan's presidency that the messianic and premillennial beliefs reached the White House in a more substantial way. Baptist minister Jerry Falwell, established in 1979 Christian right group called the Moral Majority. Boyer calls Falwell Reagan's confidant, and Falwell believed that God would use nuclear power to destroy the universe, and therefore, as he put it, we don't need to go to bed at night wondering if someone's going to push the button and destroy the planet between now and sunrise, because it's anyway going to be destroyed by God's will. Marion Gordon Pat Robertson is an American media mogul, former Republican presidential candidate and former Southern Baptist minister, who believed that the rule of Antichrist began in 1967 after Israel's capture of Jerusalem, and that Armageddon would happen in 1982. In addition to Falwell and Robertson, Reagan also liked Billy Graham, once considered the greatest living American. President Reagan had so many millennialists around him that in October 1984, the New York Times considered it proper to warn the president in its editorial quotation, "Many Armageddonists are among Mr. Reagan's most enthusiastic supporters," the Daily warned, and added that some Americans suspect Mr. Reagan of also seeing those signs is not surprising. In 1980, as on several occasions before he ran for president, he said, "We may be the generation that sees Armageddon." And just a few days before the editorial was published, President Reagan, during Sunday's debate, said, "No one knows whether Armageddon is 1,000 years away or day after tomorrow." In 1984, Yankelevich poll demonstrated that 25% of Americans expected that God would spare them from the coming Holocaust. Although apocalyptically convenient year of 2000 did not provide expected industry of apocalypse, September 11 that followed indeed did, or better to say, it reinforced apocalyptic beliefs. In a 2002 survey, 59% of all the respondents in the US confirmed that they believed in the prophecies of the Book of Revelation, which is of course the major book for all millennialists, the last book of the New Testament, while 17% expected end time during their lifetime. Moreover, 1/4 of Americans believed that September 11 was predicted and mentioned in the Bible. Quite conveniently, Tim LaHaye became new super celebrity, another Baptist minister among televangelists, and his phenomenon is very characteristic for everything to do with Hollywood apocalypse after 2000, especially the biblical part. He was a prolific author with dozens of self-help and religious books. He even claimed that sexual life of Christian women was much better than of those who were atheists in one of his books. And he was co-founder of the Moral Majority group. But he became a real celebrity with the series Left Behind, published in 13 books between 1995 and 2007, with prequel in 3 books, and it was sold altogether in 65 million copies. And to the question why this phenomenon really appeared, Newsweek tried to reply. And they gave the following explanation. "Check the news tonight as the world gets increasingly scary, with much of the trouble centered in the Middle East," because this happens in the early 2000s. "Just where would just what you would expect from the Book of Revelation. Even secular Americans sometimes wonder, or at least wonder if they ought to start wondering, whether there might be not something to this end times stuff. After September 11, 2001, there was such a run on the latest Left Behind volume Desecration that it became the best-selling novel of the year. That's, of course, one. Sorry, I don't know why we can't see the whole presentation. So these are the novels from the Left Behind series. And what is the story in Left Behind series? It explains what happens after the rapture, an event when the good will be taken to the heavens and the rest will remain in the earth to face the last 7 years of tribulation, Christ's second coming. The list of those left behind has political connotations. Among them will be new Secretary General of the UN, who is later revealed to be the Antichrist coming from Europe, actually from Romania. A majority, of course, he's a new incarnation of vampire and Dracula. Then, of course, among those who would be left behind, the majority of Roman Catholics, new Roman Pope Rome, and most of members of other non-Baptist churches and homosexuals. The new Secretary General of the UN, Nicolae Carpathia, pretending to be a pacifist, and that is the most despised group for millennialists, wants to disarm all the countries. He facilitates ordinary people, moves new global capital to New Babylon. Conveniently, the war in Iraq was just going on. And establishes the new global community with his own troops called peacekeepers. So peacekeepers are actually the army of the devil. In an interview for the Daily Telegraph, Lahey said, "We would like to make a film. The Passion of the Christ has shown Hollywood that there is an audience." So he hoped to make an audience for films of this kind. But actually, Left Behind series, when they were filmed, they did not really give any huge... There was not huge response to it, at least not positive response. It was only the film Knowing with Nicolas Cage in 2009 that was popular, but this film is more based on Ezekiel than on the Book of Revelation, so it's not really a classical rapture movie, although it includes some of those elements. But just to realize how far it goes, there have been various initiatives originating from Left Behind phenomenon. One of the most interesting is Rapture Index, provided by Rapture Ready website, which makes it easier to keep believers under constant fear, because every day they check what's the Rapture Index. So if you're interested, what's the Rapture Index today? It's 187, and you should know that everything above 160, as they say, you should face your seat belt, because you're just about to be raptured. Of course, it's not the worst possible or the best possible from their point of view. Index, the best happened on October the 10th, 2016. Although himself a believer, President Barack Obama was particularly unpopular among Christian evangelicals, and although mainstream of the movement mostly avoided to identify him with the devil, lower echelons actually did that dirty job, and many premillennialists actually felt that he had something to do with the devil. Trump-Pence administration equally flirted with biblical evangelists like Reagan's administration, and biblical narratives are indeed still there. They were designed to spread politics of fear, to frighten believers that alleged moral degradation of America could leave it without God's mercy. And when the Supreme Court suspended federal ban on the prohibition of abortion, it was actually the victory of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. And if we go back to that first slide that I showed, you will see what was political agenda when the moral majority was established, and you can see why what recently happened with the Supreme Court decision may actually be considered as their great victory. When rioters tried to take the Capitol They were certainly inspired by totally divergent streams. As we could hear, they were a crowd without leadership, etc. But biblical millennialism was certainly among the main sources of inspiration. But this is only the first element of apocalyptic movies. In addition to biblical apocalypse, there is also its secular form. Scientific progress faced humans with the possibility that humankind could be terminated not by divine will, but by various forces of nature or by cosmic phenomena. In the era of French Revolution's idea of the end emerged, of the end of the world through some non-biblical event emerged, and biographer of Mozart, Friedrich von Schlichtegrol, he suggested that Iceland should be potential sanctuary for human race in the era of the French Revolution. The theme was very much exploited in fin de siècle Vienna, and it got additional impetus after Hiroshima. Secularized version of Apocalypse was provided at the end of 1992 by William Rees-Mogg the father. If we are lucky, he said, mankind as it is has about 50 years left, he said. Most of graphs of human development, population, ecology, technology, nuclear proliferation, and the spread of disease are on the explosive curve. The lines shoot off the graph somewhere in the middle of the next century, meaning about 2050. So we have some 20 years of more before the end. This sort of apocalyptic fears also reached the White House, and Al Gore is considered by his opponents as an eco-pessimist and by his proponents as eco-realist. But as in most other forms of pessimisms, we just mentioned realism, realism appears as cosmetically improved version of its pessimistic original. Secularized apocalypse created new genre of movies that leave audience without any consolation and simply face them with the possibility that humankind could very easily disappear. On the Beach from 1959, with its remake in 2000, is one such example. In one of the final scenes, Captain of USS Charleston, one of the last survivors of mankind, who is at that moment in Australia, the last continent to be affected by a nuclear cloud, addresses his crew with a kind of prayer which sounds more like a question on whether human history had any meaning at all. Dear God, the captain says in his last word, dear God or whoever, if you are out there now and you are with us, we hope that there has been a point to this, and we ask if all the lives that have ever been lived have not been lived in vain. That would be too cruel a joke. The Day After, made in 1983, was about a very realistic possibility of nuclear annihilation between the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact. Apparently, it had quite a profound influence on Ronald Reagan and US Joint Chief of Staff, and facilitated the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. And in this way, President Reagan had a very peculiar experience to be deeply affected by both versions of American apocalypticism, the secular and the biblical form. And I will just show you one very, very short sequence from that film, about 30 seconds, to realize why it caused such a huge impression. Of course, graphic of the film is very outdated in comparison with what we have today, so you should think in terms of 1983. Or to give another very short part that was probably the most graphic. I think that's good enough to understand why the film actually produced quite a huge effect. And this actually shows that apocalyptic movies can have actually a very positive outcome, that they can warn. It happens very rarely, but this is one such instance that even apocalyptic movies can create a positive change. The idea of apocalypse was coupled with utopias. As Hans Magnus Enzensberger noted, the idea of the end of the world is simply a negative utopia. Therefore, it is not surprising that fusion of biblical and secular apocalypses had to happen at some point. And it indeed happened in films like 2012, which is a replica of Noah's story, or the film Knowing, which, of course, exploits Ezekiel. What is specifically new in the movie industry after 2001 is that there is a growing number of movies announcing total and secular apocalypses, the ones that leave audience with the same question as the film On the Beach. Was this all just a cruel joke? This is different in comparison with previous imagination of secular apocalypse. The imagination of disaster, the apocalyptical imagination, usually carried with it, claims Krishan Kumar, a sense of hope or something constructive emerging from the ruins. In other words, end was often seen as a new beginning, strengthening in that way the cyclical or spiral conception of history. A new type of dystopia appeared at the end of the 20th century, the one that leaves no hope, no consolation, and no meaning. The 20th century is sometimes described as the century of self, the century when humans realize their psychological inner worlds filled with fears, neuroses, and anxiety. So what makes these humans, us, who are aware of ourselves, increasingly obsessed with watching films that actually announce potential total annihilation of human race, in other words, the destruction of ourselves. In biblical version, it is clear that anxiety comes as a result of timor mortis that has already been mentioned, probably the main source of all human fears and phobias. Apocalypse is actually redemption for those who are worthy of it, and is therefore optimistic, at least for those who believe in it. But what happens with secular, hopeless and meaningless apocalypse? In ancient world, opponents accused Gnostics of having very poor opinion of cosmos and a very good opinion of themselves. Gnostics claimed that they were godlike, all humans were godlike, but cosmos was mean. In contemporary world, some scientific theories went actually further than Gnostics. And Stephen Hawking is one such example. And he, as well as many other contemporary theoretical physicists, actually claim that the destiny of the universe depends on the amount of matter in it. Whether it is above or below critical level, it does not change its final destiny. In both cases, everything visible would ultimately disappear. From the two apocalyptic spectacles, one could only draw the conclusion that the universe, whether finite or infinite, has no inherent meaning, since in both cases, in both final scenarios, it comes unstoppably to its own annihilation. And this source of despair you can see in a very recent film called Don't Look Up, which actually the end of the world happens for no reason. It simply happens. It happens for, of course, natural phenomena. And of course, the last man who survives, Jason, finds himself totally alone with his Twitter. And actually, the final end of humanity is the moment when he realizes there is no one who could like his tweets or his posts. And that is the final end, the final dystopia. It is in the world where inherent... I'm coming. I think we can switch on the lights because there is nothing more. It is in the world where inherent or essential meaning of everything has been challenged, and in the world of post-truth, that this new obsession with apocalypse has emerged. But is this obsession going to moderate or to infuriate anxiety? As with horror movies and ghost stories, replies will be individual. But to the main question, what sort of social impacts will these films have, we do not yet have a clear answer, except to conclude that contemporary humans are massively faced with anxiety. Saint Augustine faced us with massa damnata. Freud has presented to us massa neurotica, the mass of neurotic modern man. And apocalyptic movies show us that there is also massa anxia, the crowd of anxiety-ridden humanity. So at the end, I should only like to try to re-emphasize the relevance of analyzing pop pessimism in scholarly way. Because as has been, I hope, demonstrated, biblical preachers do not need any instruction on how to deal with massa anxia, and they indeed have just made their huge recent legal victory. So if liberal stream would like to give any answer, it needs first to understand why this fusion of anxiety and apocalypticism has happened, and this could really help liberals deal with the whole phenomenon, particularly in America, where they just experienced a very huge defeat. So, in other words, although this may seem very far from us, it's about apocalypse, it's about rapture, it's not. It has really very huge social implications, and actually at this very moment, very dramatic results in the US, and creates incredible divisions that, by the way, in several recent articles in the Washington Post were described as a potential beginning of the Civil War in America. So the Washington Post, not some tabloid. And from that point of view, all of this is actually very relevant. Thank you.
Slobodan, thank you very much indeed for this really comprehensive overview, but also some visually very compelling images. Not to say graphic, but just really interesting. So let me open it up to questions, comments on Slobodan's presentation, and then a more general discussion involving all panelists. Questions to Slobodan? Christopher.
First of all, when you mentioned that, who did you say would be looking from the heavens at the destruction of the world? I mean, that's a very strong theme that runs, of course, across the centuries. I remember St. Aquinas saying that the thing he looked most forward about in going to heaven was to spend eternity watching the miseries and sufferings of people in hell. So it's not new. Schadenfreude, perhaps, to a certain extent, on a cosmic scale. But you mentioned the word hope, and I think this is very important, because pessimism, you have to unpack whether hope is good or bad. And if you remember the legend of Pandora's box, where hope escapes after she shuts it, or just before she shuts it, the Greeks were not convinced that actually hope was good, that hope should have been kept firmly in the box, together with all the other evils that he had unleashed. And this was very much Nietzsche's opinion, that hope was delusional, and it set you back from achieving what you could achieve don't delude yourself into thinking you can achieve more than you can. So, of course, Nietzsche would have been very critical of the utopianism of the 20th century. In the Middle Ages, of course, in Christianity, hope is for the afterlife. I mean, you're hoping to go to heaven. You're not hoping for very much in this world. And then, of course, after the Holocaust, people began quoting Kafka, and Kafka's famous phrase, "There's hope, but not for us," which means there's not hope for this generation. Look at what we've actually done, Hiroshima and the Holocaust. How can you expect this generation to actually achieve very much? So I think I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. It seems to me that pessimism is grounded on being very skeptical about the usefulness of hope, which doesn't mean, of course, as I said at the end of the last conference, that pessimism is cynicism. But it can actually have a positive effect if you don't delude yourself into thinking that humanity can do more than it actually can.
Well, I think that we look things from our own standpoint, which is liberal, and if most of humanity cannot be redeemed, we look at that as a kind of pessimism. But if you go back to St. Augustine, who introduced this term, massa damnata, he was actually, from his own point of view, an optimist, although he may be considered by us as a huge pessimist. So basically he said that Adam's sin was so great that every single human deserved eternal damnation. And if God was only just, that's what would happen. All the humanity would be massa damnata. But God is not only just, he's also full of grace. So he's going to give to lucky few, and actually, at least in his later years, he believed in the number 144,000 because he wrote Numerus est certus in one of his late works, and aperuit in Apocalyptem, which was in the book, it appeared in the book of Apocalypse. So all the rest, billions, they will be sentenced to eternal damnation. But St. Augustine insisted we should not ask God why he saves only the lucky few. I use, of course, current terminology. He didn't use lucky few, of course. Why only handful? Because everyone deserves damnation. It only shows how great God is and how merciful he is by saving 144,000 who obviously have hope. So it all depends how you look at it. And I think that what you see with the tele-evangelicals, they are actually full of hope. It's just that for us, everything they preach looks hopeless because we are so much immersed with the everyday world that everyday world is our only point of reference. Basically, we lost eschatology after Nietzsche, and that's one of favorite topics of those dealing with the history of pessimism. So the world without God is, to a very huge degree, the world without hope. I would argue, and from that point of view, it only strengthens pessimistic streams.
I will bring you in just a minute. Just there are a couple of things I'd like to pick up on. One is, as you were talking, Christopher, I was reminded of this famous phrase in English football when a club is fighting relegation and no one thinks they can escape. It's basically a done deal even before the final game. And when the coach essentially asks why that's the case, someone says, because it's the hope that kills you. So there's also this association in popular sport of hope and expectations with essentially death, with the end of something, with something apocalyptic, like the relegation of your team. So that's an interesting thing. But Slobodan, when you were talking about St. Augustine, I think you write about the emphasis in some of the later works. But then there's also this tension in Augustine and in lots of Christian theology between, on the one hand, a very, you may say, more gloomy vision of humanity, totally depraved, totally destined for damnation and hell, on the one hand, but also this idea that hope is the most realistic because not just of the crucifixion, but the fact of the resurrection, the fact that the kingdom is already here, that there isn't some sort of reality in the afterlife, that the kingdom has already started because of Christ's resurrection, and the fact that we have already been shown that that a different life is possible. And baptism is, of course, in some sense, both death and the beginning of a new life in this world. So what do you make then of that tension within the Christian tradition between these two versions? I mean, are they just irreconcilable, or is there a bridge? Because I think Augustine's also saying we already live in the city of God. We just, in some sense, don't realize it, and we should be, building that kingdom here rather than waiting for the afterlife.
Well, certainly it's not the same in the Civitate Dei and in these late works, the Corruptione et Gratia, the Predestinatio Sanctorum, etc., and etc. But what is important is that in intellectual history of Europe, we do not deal with Saint Augustine, but with Augustinism, and Augustinism is based on late Saint Augustine. But you're right, in Catholic and Orthodox theologies, it's there. Some Orthodox saints even believed in universal salvation. Everyone will be saved, including the devil himself, because Christ did not take wine for some, but for everyone. But it's very far from Protestant and early Protestant understanding of all of that. So that's one thing. The problem with millennialist theology is that actually there is another stream of interpretation, and that is that there is Princeps huius mundi, the devil of the prince of this world, the devil. And as you know, the devil tempts Christ and tells him, "Haec omnia tibi dabo," I'm going to give you all of this. So he is the ruler of this world until the millennium comes, in a way. So you can also interpret it this way. And he will particularly be the ruler of this world during the year of tribulation. So yes, Christ is here, but the devil is here as well. And that is the whole game about all of that. And you could emphasize one thing or the other, and various denominations emphasize other things. Certainly in post-Tridentine Catholicism, everything becomes more and more universal and closer to Greek Orthodox points. And certainly today, at least apostolic churches believe in almost general salvation. But this is not the point of millennialism, and that is what gives them this huge power, and this is what gives them this possibility of policy of fear, because exactly their believers are afraid that they are not going to be in the skies watching the rest of sinful humanity being annihilated. And so that interpretation is, dispensationalist interpretation is what is important, at least for that stream of Christianity.
Thank you. Fernando first, and then...
One quick question, and then it's mostly about a reception theory about the film that you have talked about. Have you seen the film No? Have you seen it?
No.
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 The film No just came out. I just saw
I
it.
haven't.
It's not a successful film, but it's trying to put another spin on apocalypse type of thing. And it's an interesting thing. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, I think you could add like another dimension to what you're saying. No. Yes or no? About the film that you have talked about, can you give us, or do you have an interest in even audience responses to those films? I mean, okay, Hollywood machine, Netflix, and all that. Here we are, right? We all consumers in the world about that. There's got to be a difference between how audiences respond to one film over another. In the US, in Mexico, in Britain, in Serbia, in Romania. Do you have a sense whether, I don't know, in Serbia they really like core, and in Romania they really like this, and why would that be? Or the Brits really like this or that? Have you got any sense of audiences responding to this type of Hollywood apocalypse thing?
Not really. It's more like I analyze American, because, I have to follow concomitantly what's aired and what are opinion polls, and I follow what Pew Foundation does. It does, by the way, for all of the world, but America is in their focus So about apocalyptic beliefs, they have series of opinion polls, so I can follow it. I cannot follow it, unfortunately, in Europe, so cannot compare it. I can only say that in American reception, you have a clear difference. When people watched On the Beach, or when people watched the day after, they were really terrified. And when people watch 2012, they see it as a kind of fun. And that is why these early scientifically based, on the quotation marks, apocalyptic films, secular apocalyptic films, they were there to warn. And these films actually there is this master of disaster director who directed most of them, Emmerich. So they are made to actually make fun and bring some money. But from the point of view of social theory, our question is, why are those films so successful? That is where we come to the point of anxiety. So it's not, motives can be different. Someone may do it, those films, simply because he likes it, like Emmerich. But Hollywood responds to it. That means Hollywood has discovered that there are viewers. It means there is an audience. So why is there an audience which is receptive to those films? And that is the phenomenon that we need to analyze. And I'm sure that it's not the same. Reception is different in different areas. You're absolutely certain. And certainly American disaster movies will be increasingly rejected in the civilizational states, because what you can see in most of those movies is America is the center of the world. If aliens are to come, and if they take New York or Washington, that's the end. Taking Washington means that you rule the world in all of them. And of course, it's American president who saves the world, or someone like that. So certainly it will be increasingly unacceptable for viewers in China, Russia. Maybe films will not be even aired. So that is, I'm sure that there will be. But like films like 2012 are neutral in that sense, that there is cooperation of the world, etc. So those films will still be there. So why Homo sapiens likes to see, of our age, likes to see those films? That's the question to which I don't have a definite answer.
Thank you very much. And then the lady first.
Thank you. I think you remember last year on 26 climate change conference, Prince William said we should not focus on colonizing other planets, but on keeping the Earth, saving our planet. Of course, the colonization of other planets is very difficult, but not impossible. So there are many things that can bring about the apocalypse. Alien invasions, nuclear accidents, pandemics, war, natural disaster. So the idea of colonizing other planets is growing among the population. My question is, could this idea represent the population's fear of disaster? Can we talk about a created anxiety among the people? Can the mass media create the fear, or the life on Earth could end? That's my question.
Okay, about aliens. In the Middle Ages, you had devil neuroses, which means people spoke with devil. I mean, some millennials speak even today with the devil, so it hasn't disappeared. Of course, Luther spoke with the devil daily, and many others. But Freud, when he wanted to, analyze one case of devil's neurosis, he couldn't find any contemporary, so he had to take historical examples. So we don't have devil's neurosis. Today we have aliens neurosis. And you have cases like the wife of a Japanese, was it the prime minister or foreign minister, who was abducted by aliens, allegedly. Or Australian top politician who had to...
Secretary General, Paris de Paro.
Oh, okay. Who had to... convince his voters that he was not a reptile. So we have, but in all those cases, it's about us. So medieval man and early modern man was afraid of the devil, And we are afraid of the unknown, and aliens are the symbol of the unknown. And you remember that when George Wells' novel was read, was it BBC? Also Wells, sorry, it was read through BBC. It created total panic. People started to become preppers at that moment. So yes, it serves that film. And I teach a subject called Image of the Other, and I start how Europeans perceive the others, and I finish with the lecture on aliens, how we perceive aliens. So others for us today are aliens. It's, by the way, very dangerous if they ever appear, because we already designated most of them as enemies. Not everyone, because you have Klingons, but you have friendly aliens. But overall, most of aliens are not friendly to us in Hollywood imaginary. So we have to be aware of that. Of course, there is a position, I think, in the UN. There is a man who is supposed to await aliens when they come and to tell them in I don't know how many languages a welcome speech. That's a very good position, I think, and very well paid for several sentences that you need to learn. So yes, there are various responses to all of this, but I think that simply aliens replace the previous fears, internal fears of the devil.
And then the lady, please.
Thank you. So, Slobodan, do you think this creation of pessimistic subjects in literature and movies are sort of a Christian obsession? Have you tried to find out, well, we spoke a lot about Saint Augustine and Nietzsche and so on, so you certainly have a Western, not to say European perspective. Have you tried to find out if there is some similar interest in, I don't know, Muslim world or Bollywood or African movies and literature, or Asian, but Asia is a special part of it. So is this a Christian obsession? To you, this apocalyptic creation, movies and literature?
Okay, here we speak about Christian and post-Christian apocalypse, but post-Christian, we shouldn't, yes, sure, but post-Christian is also Christian, because it comes from Christian tradition. Well, as much as Christianity is world religion, everything that is produced through cultural transfer comes everywhere, particularly as long as the United States had such a dominant cultural position in the world. So this all has global consequences. It is completely independent from the question of how we should repudiate Eurocentrism. It goes without question that we should. But cultural transfer simply, as a concept, has explained to us how ideas are spread globally, and they are spread anyway. So the one who possesses power, who possesses cultural hegemony, spreads them. And from that point of view, what Hollywood does, it has immediate global implications, I think, everywhere. 1983 was watched by, it was aired on Soviet television just after the signing of the, for instance, of the nuclear treaty of 1987. Or just before, I'm not sure, but that year. So all these films are aired everywhere, and just go to China and you will see that they even copy European cities occasionally. So simply, it is not something to be very fond of, or to say, you know, of course it's all remnants of Eurocentrism, but it is how it works for the time being. And now, what are local adaptations of all of this? I'm unfortunately not qualified to speak about that. For that, we would have to invite an expert on Chinese movies, on Bollywood, Japanese movies. I see recent Korean very popular series, which is one of the best examples of nihilism. I haven't seen anything similar. So really, which is, by the way, a very Christian country, more Christian than most of European countries. This is how the world has become global.
Yes, I was mostly speaking about Bollywood because Bollywood is making 8 times more movies than Hollywood. Are they addressing the Indian or the Asian population in the same way, apocalyptically speaking?
I'm ashamed to say that I don't know, but now you have encouraged me to do research in that field.
At next year's conference, that's what you'll be presenting on. There won't be one. There won't be one. We won't be here. Okay, so before the apocalypse descends upon us, Alexander, then Christopher, and no doubt others.
Thank you. Well, look, just a quick aside about when's pessimism actually useful to people. There is actually some quite interesting recent medical literature on life preparedness for shock amongst 50, 60-something and 70-something-year-olds, which shows that if you have a slightly more pessimistic disposition, you're more likely to survive a major health challenge in your late age. So it's a quite interesting stuff about basically priming. How much does that priming help you then tackle a very significant shock to your system? But it is only one study. Slobodan, I was just interested in asking a question. You obviously, I'm a big fan of Neville Shute. I've never actually seen the series or indeed the original movie, but read all his novels avidly some years ago. Christopher was obviously talking about video games. You've got basically novels, you've got video games, and you've got movies or TV series. I'd be interested in what perspective you have about which has most salience in terms of influencing the public mood. Because you might, for example, have a novel that's much more widely read than the film version, or a film version that captures the public imagination in a different way to the novel. My second question is a more specific one, and this may be one that we could probe collectively, which is, to what extent you've alluded to the fact that some of this nuclear filmmaking did then influence political principles, like Reagan, as they thought about policy making. It might be quite interesting to see, in a sense, what is the feedback loop into policy. So Christopher talked about the escapist loop, as it were, for soldiers thinking about, zombies as the perfect kill zone enemy. But I'm struck, for example, by there was a chap called William Forster, I think, who wrote 1 Second After in 2009. And he was a frustrated, I think, brigadier in the American military system who felt that the American system wasn't taking electromagnetic pulses seriously enough. So it wasn't about the complete apocalyptic framework for the planet, but it's what if you had a major incident, be it a solar flare or be it some kind of military or terrorist attack, that led to an EMP that basically eliminated the ability of most electronics to work. And so he was so frustrated, he wrote a novel about it, which isn't a very good novel, but it sold very widely. And what was interesting is that that novel, 1 Second After, is much more widely read and used in training than anything he wrote as an official. So is there also an interesting sort of loop here where, if you like, the frustrated official who can't get their anxiety across or their focus on one aspect of resilience finds a different platform through the lever of popular culture?
Well, I think if Marx, to this question, what is more important, video games or films or novels, I think that if Marx was alive, he would have to reformulate this idea, proletarians of all the states should unite. He should say bubbles of all kinds should unite, because we all live in bubbles, and you have young people who live in their bubble of Warcraft game or some other game, and that's their whole life. And certainly some of them use some apocalyptic or pseudo-apocalyptic games. So it becomes increasingly complex to analyze this society that is fragmented to such a degree. So what we call an average, sociological average, may be totally meaningless in many aspects. And we should think about that as well. That's my main point about that. And I think that films have a bigger impact than anything else. That's my opinion. Take, for instance, something that doesn't have to deal with apocalypse, but William Wallace, for instance. Can you really write a factual monograph that could counteract against misinterpretations in that film? You can, but it will not have any effect. So simply, William Wallace from the film is a William Wallace for several next generations, for, like several decades to come, until new William Wallace film is made with the same kind of audience, huge audience. So films are really very powerful metaphors, and they really make a huge impact. And this generation is visual, but so video games can be another form. We are now faced with addiction to video games. There are people who die sometimes playing video games for consecutive 72 hours or whatever. So certainly in those bubbles where people are totally addicted to video games produce their worldview. So I don't really know, a sociologist is unlikely, a pollster is unlikely to find those people. They are at their homes, because pollsters, they do polls by, calling people or by meeting people in the streets. They're not going to meet them in the streets, so they are not in the sample at all. So I don't really know how to approach this increasing complexity, but certainly video games produce very, very, very huge. I don't know how many of us. We can make a kind of our own poll. How many of us play video games every day? Except me. 2, 3. Okay, so 4. Okay, that's more than, it's 20% of the sample here. So you see, it certainly impacts at least 4 of us here. So.
There's mostly elderly people here. No offense, but not too many young.
Okay, so if I'm exempted from that category, thank you. So that would be my answer. The second question is, I think, for Christopher.
Feedback loop.
Just a feedback loop. It's an open question, I think, for all of us, which is just to what degree does that happen?
When it came to the Reagan administration, it's interesting that his environmental secretary did not believe that the national parks needed any protection because he expected Armageddon to come during his lifetime. So that's a real case, I think, which is worth thinking about. On the EMP, I see now that 87% of Americans spend nearly all their quality time on the internet. So if you were to switch the internet off, that would be apocalypse for them. It really would. They'd have to start making some friends quickly, and those social skills would have been lost a long time before, because all their friends would be on the net, of course, or social media bubbles. But I wanted to ask Slobodan a question about the aesthetics of apocalypse. So I think it's very interesting why we love seeing the end of the world. And the first popular artist was Martin, forget his first name, in the 19th century. These great panoramic pictures of the end of the world. They're absolutely fascinating. But art was dead by the end of the 20th century in terms of really changing and being a social force. So it became cinema. And Cyberberg's famous 7-hour film on Hitler has a thesis that Hitler did the Second World War in order to film it and watch it every night in the bunker to see the destruction of cities and the destruction of human life. And Heidegger takes up this point in the 1950s. He said the Second World War was essentially a cinematic experience for people as they watched the end of the world. And many people enjoyed that. It's reflected in some of Evelyn Waugh's novels about the Second World War, actually, the Blitz in London, or indeed people going up to Primrose Hill, not very far from you, Nikolai, during the Blitz to watch it, because it was so fascinating a spectacle to see the end of the world, or at least a facsimile of it. So what is it about the aesthetics? Is this in our biological DNA, that we are a destructive and aggressive species that even entertains the thought of our own extinction as an aesthetic experience? You know, is there a kind of is this Freud's death instinct that we all have hardwired into us? Or is it a cultural fact that at this particular time, everything is screen related, so everything has to be on the screen? That's how we appreciate reality, not through our eyes in person, but on the screen. Is this aesthetic of destruction takes a cultural form?
Well, it's that a question, but from the point of view of psychoanalysis, it depends whether you're a sadist or a masochist. So if you're a sadist, certainly there is a hidden aggression and you like it. But if you're a masochist, you actually torture yourself by watching it, but some internal impulse forces you to watch it all the time, compels you to go over and over, to live through traumatic events. So there is this trauma, repeated trauma, which of course is for some reason susceptible to many people, but there is also hidden aggression. It depends individually. That would be psychoanalytic reply. But about aesthetics, it's beyond my comprehension.
I'm keen to bring in the audience if there are more questions or comments, but likewise, if there aren't for the moment, then I'd like to raise one question which I think relates to all three presentations, which is this relationship between personal anxiety and political decay. And I'm not suggesting there is a simple answer and, you know, which comes first, but how do we think about this? Is it more the decay that now feeds and fuels the anxiety? Or is it that because people are anxious, risk adverse, and sort of angst ridden, that we're also seeing political decay? So how do we think about this? And if civilization is very much, as I think a number of people have suggested, but in particular Michael Clark, is about self-belief, how do we break out of this vicious circle? And how can we possibly reinstill some self-belief so that one could escape the cycle of decay and anxiety? Or is it just something that will take, you know, a generation or two, unless, of course, the apocalypse intervenes before? So it's really to all three panelists. Christopher, your microphone is on, so I take it that you want to respond.
I go through life thinking there's a microphone always in front of me, so it's not always on, unfortunately. I don't really know the answer to your question. The political decay has been identified by the Financial Times as a financial one. We don't pay people enough to go into politics. And the people who do go into politics either have enough money of their own, but for them this is just a sideshow, and they don't take it very seriously because they have no ideological beliefs or no vision whatsoever, or it's just, you know, the only job they can get is to be an MP. And the quality of our members of parliament now is absolutely disgraceful, and the quality of constituency parties that nominate them and put them where they are in parliament is absolutely disgraceful. So all political parties, particularly the two major ones in my country, do urgently need reform, but I don't see that the reform is coming from anywhere. I just want to make a general point, about the anxiety and where it comes from. There's a very famous book by Tainter in the 1950s about the collapse of societies. They collapse when you reach a level of complexity. The system can no longer cope with that level of complexity. And he analyzed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Mayan Empire, I think, and one other. And I think that we have reached now technological levels of complexity, and the Internet of Things will be one of the great disasters as our vulnerability. As we become more and more vulnerable, people are aware, I think, without being able to necessarily give a voice to their awareness, that we are at a very critical stage now. And we either make the leap or we have the general collapse. And the problem is that if you have the general collapse, you'll never get back, because you'll never be able to rebuild what you originally built. And there's enough of this reflected, I think, in the movies that they see all the time. Yes, you have the heroic human beings, as you said, sometimes saving the day. Independence Day, you have the American president, just happens fortunately to be a fighter, ex-fighter pilot, and take out that one spaceship and sacrifice himself. But nobody believes that, of course, because we have no heroes. You may remember the crowd after 9/11 when they went to Ground Zero with placards, "Where are the heroes who are going to help us in the war against terror," which the president has just declared. Where indeed were the heroes? Perhaps they're unsung, perhaps they're out there. Navy SEAL people whose names we never actually hear. As Donald Rumsfeld said, we'll win the war on terror, but not on television. It won't be filmed, he said. The victory will not be filmed. There's no Hiroshima moment, no liberation of Berlin moment. This is perhaps what people need. They need to see the heroes in action. I don't believe they think that there are heroes any longer who will save the day. They think that's kind of myth. So I don't think that I can't, in a sense, ideationally what you're asking, because I don't think people can generally. I just get a feeling, which may be age, as you quite rightly said, most people in this room are of a certain age, that I just feel in my pulses, as Keats said, that people are beginning to think, as you said, Alexander, that we've reached, it's the end of the transition. It's more than just the end of the transition. It's the next leap forward, but do we fall at that point? I think they're, and rightly, genuinely concerned that we may fall.
Slobodan, Alexander maybe first, and then Slobodan.
Sure.
So thank you. I mean, Adrian, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's very difficult. It becomes a chicken and egg issue, right? I mean, is it clearly personal anxiety feeds off political decay, and vice versa. But I think it'd be very difficult to definitively say one comes first. I just wonder. I'm not generally a creature of great optimism, but I just wonder if there is a difference that we can again make about the temporal moment. So I think right now, yes, we do well to be somewhat anxious about what this means for politics, at least, and again, it's contextual to where we are, at least in European democracies or in North America. But I wonder, but partly because our reference point was more positive 20, 30 years ago. So as the decision makers, most of the decision makers in Europe are in their 40s or their mid-50s. And they came of age at the end of the Cold War and into the 90s. And that's actually really important because that zeitgeist context for them then shaped their worldview and shaped their perspective on history. I think in the 2030s and the 40s, the reference point will be now. And we don't really know what the now is, and we don't yet know, in a sense, how that generation will interpret the now. But I think there could, if you like, be a more positive turn 15, 20 years hence, as that generation look at a more positive framework against what may be seen as quite difficult years that we're going to live through now.
Well, I'll start with the age. There is a book called Marketing Apocalypse by Stephen Brown and others, and they argue in that book that most of secular theoreticians of apocalypse are in their 40s. And the reason why they are in their 40s is because in the 40s you start to feel some sort of sexual uncertainty, which of course then translates into general uncertainty, and you're more prone to deal with apocalypse. The other thing is that we live in the first century, the second century actually, but if we take from Freudian era, 100 years, it's still the same century, where phobias are generally acknowledged, and we can actually, for the first time, we don't need to be ashamed of our phobias. We can actually say, oh, I have that and that phobia, and everyone else in the era of political correctness needs to accept it and deal with it. So phobias are there. And our anxiety is very much related to the body politics. So we are very much, the industry and everything else is concerned with the decay of our body. We want to preserve our body as long as we can. And of course, millennialists have a very good solution for all of that. They say Christ was crucified in his earthly incarnation at the age of 33. So he was resurrected, his body was resurrected at the age of 33 approximately. So we all, during rapture or during millennium, will also be resurrected at the age of 33. So their believers know that they will have their body intact in the most perfect physical condition. But what about secular apocalypse? Well, who should we address to have our body preserved? But certainly not politicians. We are going to address industry, technology, science, and that's why they are gods of our age and not politicians. This is not the age of revolution. We don't demand political rights. We demand our bodies to be preserved in perfect health as long as it is possible. And that is, in my opinion, the main reason why there is political decay, because there is no political demand. Politicians cannot solve that. They are not medical experts. And unless all politicians get as their required qualifications to be MDs, nothing is going to change in that sense.
Can I just add a little footnote that the English writer Saki, who was definitely a pessimist, with Alexander the Great in mind, who of course died at 32, said that to have survived to 33 is to have failed. I think one should bear that in mind.
So the 43 is the new 33, because I always thought that Christ lived until the age of 33, but maybe there's some...
I lived and died the same year.
Yes, historical dispute. Thank you very much indeed, all three of you. Are there more questions or comments as we approach the end of the session?
The end of all things.
If not all things. What's the phrase? Anyone for any more? Or shall we break early for lunch?
Yeah.
Not knowing whether it is the last lunch. Okay, well, in which case it only leaves me to thank the audience. You've been both very patient and very engaged, so thank you so much. And of course, our three speakers, Christopher, Alexander and Slobodan. Thank you all very much.